of I thought as I start to get ready to go through this, if you take the time to maybe drop in the chat what you all have seen as the weirdest or the most unusual use case for AI, and then perhaps we can hit those as we go through it. But I'm kind of interested, not on the mainstream. I'll show you some of the mainstream AI use cases. I'm really kind of interested to hear what people have seen on the more kind of crazy side or unusual side. So with that, I'm George T. I'm the Associate General Counsel, VP of Compliance. I work with our clients, obviously across a range of governance related obligations and solutions. My background is in advisory work, in addition to the work I've done with technologies, and always using the latest and advanced technologies as part of our work. So today we're going to talk about the role of AI, just a setup. As if you guys have attended any of my prior sessions, you'll see I always try and provide a little context, a little setup, and some data. And we're going to talk a little bit about the government's view of governance around AI, some objectives and frameworks that are developing, some lessons from the real world. We actually have them, and then some recommendations for 2024, at least to start to get your feet on the ground to the extent you don't already have them. So let me talk a little bit about the role of AI. And I thought I'd start with this data, which I thought was really interesting. So when we think about AI, we're often thinking about all the different ways companies or people or sometimes governments, not so much yet, are using AI. But I thought this was particularly interesting because it looked at the view of AI from the CEO's desk. And it was the view of what, first of all, what they were actually, whether or not they were using AI, and in this case, it was around ChatGPT, and then for what use case and for what purpose. And I thought it was really important because this is giving you a really good sense that 3 out of 4 CEOs at this point are already trying to use ChatGPT in this instance. And that's a lot because if you go back to the beginning of 2023, when we started this year, we didn't really have that much penetration. ChatGPT was really just coming into the fold. We really were not seeing, the huge uptake that we've already seen, the course of the year. So to go to this level, the 3 out of 4 CEOs this quickly, and this was actually taken in the midpoint in 2023, it's pretty astounding. And it also points to something else, which is if you had to predict how CEOs might actually leverage ChatGPT, you probably would have predicted these two things, right? Which is maybe some general writing and editing, some research, and everything else kind of falls below. So it points out that the people who are carrying the purse strings and the governance responsibilities ultimately are actually working with and trying out this technology. So now we're going to look at a broader set of how AI, the view of AI from, I call it mortal humans, which is the rest of us. And this is about 4,000 respondents total across the UK, Canada, and the US. Now, I didn't have or could not identify a good set of data that was broad enough that also included Australia, but I did at least pick 3 other English-speaking countries and 3 English-speaking countries that have a common definition of these terms. And so the question that Gartner in this case asked was, rank the words in order around AI. And what was interesting is if you look at the first 2, they're negative, right? Both, across the UK, Canada, and the US, complex and threatening. And the next 2 are obviously positive. They're very different though, and they're very closely associated in the sense that, they're top 4, but they are highly divergent. And then if you look down at the bottom 2, you have the same thing. Number 9 is unnecessary, number 10 is effective. They're highly divergent. They're diametrically opposed in the latter sense. And so what we're able to derive from this is that the AI market is still really dynamic. People are forming an opinion around its use. And the reason it's important in governance is because this is going to impact how the view of how AI or any technology or any other policy or practice evolves it impacts how governments respond. It impacts how regulators respond. And so this is giving you a good sense too how regulators and governments are responding because they're a little bit confused and they're trying to sort this all out, just like the rest of us. So this is a top generative AI top use cases by industry. I looked at a couple of other examples of this. They were very similar. I thought this was actually the cleanest way it was represented because it looked at it both from a use case and then also from an industry perspective. So the primary use case for generative AI in particular, at least in this survey, again, this is a Gartner survey, was around content creation. And it's everything from code to text. Code, by the way, is a significant area, and you'll see there's some good examples out here and some cases. Um, Conversational AI, chatbots, every kind of thing is, sees it. I was really interested to see the simulation around drug discovery. It just shows the complexity of the ability to derive value from huge amounts of information and find these very subtle inferences um, between them, between different sets of data and relationships. But what was important from a takeaway perspective is one, government it has exceedingly low expectations for use. And in the US, which is interesting, I haven't seen this similar um, a requirement in Australia or elsewhere, but there was just recently a requirement that all of the federal agencies identify within 60 days a chief AI officer, which of course is classic government. We're going to just name somebody into a position, make that person's title AI or whatever it is for that day, and that's going to solve the problem. But here you can still see the expectations for use in government is low, and we see the same thing here in the U.S. And there's a lot of reasons for it, and I can get into it. But healthcare also is a little surprising, but there's a reason for this as well. And the reason for healthcare is there's a lot of regulation around it, and I'm going to show you an example. There's also a real concern around privacy, and I think that that is one of the key features of why you don't really see the uptake here. Government, we all get. Um, the systems are old, they're legacy, they're not integrated. The government has spent decades building siloed systems, custom integrations that does not work well with AI. Um, the the other takeaway though is because content creation is such a high portion of this, the use cases by industry, um, this has a lot of impact potentially on records and compliance obligations, right? Just think about all of the things that you have today that when records are created, when business objects are created, when something happens from a business perspective that needs to be captured and managed, if that's all happening now by a robot, by a generative AI bot of some kind, that's all kinds of information that you have to capture and meets all the same obligations you have today. So that's one of the things you have to look at right away. So then you have to balance AI use against the risks. And so this is a different research. This is a S&P 451 group. And so they were looking at the top concerns around AI and ML workloads. And it's probably no surprise if you spend any time kind of watching this space, that security is number one. Cost is up there. And then you get to reliability and the manageability and ease of use. And really these four represent, ironically, some of the things that you'll see in the frameworks that the governments have proposed as being areas of particular concern or areas of responsibility. The manageability and the ease of use is one of the things that I think will likely actually transcend some of these other items, especially costs. As costs come down, it's going to just get to the point of how are we actually managing the use of this? And again, I've got a couple of examples of where this is important. The rest of this other stuff, and by the way, governance, I think here was mislabeled in the sense that a lot of these are really forms of governance. Governance is a separate standalone idea. Probably was misplaced on the survey, but everything else just gets into small technical minutia. All right, so let me stop for a second. I wanted to take a look here real quick and see if there were any interesting suggestions on how any interesting use cases, but apparently not. So I'll move on. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit then about the governance view of AI and AI governance. This is a high level view. I've got a couple slides here that will follow that go down another level. If you were with a prior, at one of my prior sessions, I shared this slide, but basically right now the the governments are producing AI frameworks. And it's because it's impossible for them, no matter what anybody says and no matter how much interest there is and how many people complain or don't complain, it's way too complex for people to actually sit down, write a statute, and get it through any sort of legislative body, whether it's here in Australia, in the EU. It's just happening too fast and it's too complicated. So what governments have been doing is putting out frameworks, giving an idea of where they would like companies to at least think about government entities, people that they work with, frameworks around how AI might need to be governed or how you should think about using and governing AI in your organizations. So I spent a little time going through Australia's, and I then took it and by the way, I've also looked at the UK and Europe, and they're very similar in some of the frameworks that have developed. And if you look at Australia and you look at the US, there's a lot of similarities. And it's, again, the same is true elsewhere. The word safe comes up a lot, and the word secure comes up a lot, and the word trust comes up a lot. And so, really, around safe, security, and trust, those are common themes, and those are common high level objectives that all of these frameworks have. Um, Australia goes and focuses a little bit on the risk of negative impact on those affected by AI applications. In the US, a little bit more prescriptive, but the same thing. It's what's the negative impact here? What's the negative impact associated with security with respect to biotech, security infrastructure, and national security dangers? Um, and balanced against this interest in Australia to help governments and business to practice these highest ethical standards when developing and designing and implementing AI. The U.S. In this, and this is the executive order that came out. In this case, the president had actually articulated something a little bit further reaching, and this gets into bias a lot, which is the government will not tolerate the use of AI to disadvantage those who've already often denied equal opportunity and justice. And so this gets into bias, it gets into fairness. And again, that gets back to what Australia's high level objectives are. The important piece is since so many of us work with multinational organizations and work across the globe, the fact that these general objectives don't really differ materially from one jurisdiction to another, or the core premise and the core objectives are the same, will help us in the long term. Now, I took and then drove this out another level, and this is the Australian AI ethics and responsible frameworks in detail. There's 8 principles, and you can see the 8 principles here on the left. And I'm going to highlight just a couple. I'm not picking these out because these are, more important than the others, but these are the ones that I believe are most likely to impact an organization right now or in 2024. And that gets to this fairness or these concepts of bias, and it gets into privacy and security, uh, reliability, and then this transparency, which is like, how does this stuff actually work? And then what's the reliability of this? And if you really focused on these 4 areas, and you'll see that these are kind of 4 areas that I focus on for 2024, these are the hot areas right now where problems actually have occurred, that they're emerging, or where people are actually spending time thinking about, and regulators are as well. All right, so then what do you do about this, right? How do you start to get your head around dealing with these risks, and what's a risk management framework, and all these other things? So there's any number that we can look at. I want to look at this one for a bit. So because I think it's the best that's out there actually and articulated in a way that can be useful. So NIST is the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. It's here in the US. They are the ones that actually promulgated, which is still today the primary industry worldwide best practice around cybersecurity. And it came out of the US. They formed it. It is the best practice globally. It's because they have some really good people thinking about problems like this. And I know I've had conversations with people here and abroad, in Australia and in the EU, and we were even just talking about cybersecurity. There's a tremendous amount of cybersecurity incidents and news in Australia these days, and I'm sure all of you have seen it. That's stuff that we've already seen. We went through that phase here in the U.S. and in Europe, and Australia just unfortunately is now catching the brunt of it because for whatever reason their systems were a little bit behind and the practices were a little bit behind what we ended up having to develop and introduce here because we were seeing the breaches before. So my suggestion here is don't be opposed to learning from abroad because there's a lot of good work that's abroad, and this I thought was very good. All right, so what is NIST's AI management framework? This goes back to, again, what are the high-level objectives that you saw in both the Australia and the American AI governance recommendations? And that is effectively harm to people. You're trying to manage the risk of harm to people, harm to an organization, or harm to the ecosystem, right? Are people's rights being violated? Is their privacy or security being violated? Is an organization's business operations impacted? Do the breaches impact their ability to operate or have monetary loss, or does it impact their organization's reputation? And how does it impact everybody else operating with them? Right? The interconnectedness that we have in all of our organizations today is enormous. So this is the framework, which is think about as you introduce AI and as you start working with AI, where does it fit within these potential risks, and then develop a risk management strategy around it. Now, this is actually, and all, by the way, all of this is in this PDF, this publication that I've got here below. But then what they say is, okay, take this, and effectively it's going to be overlaid with this, right? What do you have to do? You have to have a safe, secure, resilient, explainable, privacy enhanced, fair, valid and reliable platform that's accountable and transparent. And again, if I go back and I look at some of these objectives here, these parts of the AI framework for Australia, they find themselves right here. And again, it's because these are consistent and common problems and common objectives that we have globally. And I thought that this was a really good model in how to then kind of frame the risk management model. All right, so let me walk through some lessons here from the real world. So some of this, if you were with me before, two of these items are the same. I've got a new one here, and then I'm going to go through detail around the rest. So there were some initial AI privacy-focused actions that came out of Europe, and they were probably the first set that kind of gave us a sense for where AI governance may be going. And this was around the EU Data Protection Board first launched a dedicated task force looking at the potential enforcement actions and implications against ChatGPT. And there's some interesting privacy implications around how ChatGPT works. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Italy had briefly banned ChatGPT because it had to do with how it was able to deal with youth interactions, which had a specific prohibition or restriction in Italy. And so here are the references to those. I've given you another one, and it's only because I lay this out because we're starting to see more actions here on this. And in the spring, there was a joint statement between the Department of Justice here, a bunch of the financial regulators, a number of them, and they basically laid out this letter and this set of objectives that said we're basically laying out this statement, and it's focused on efforts to protect the public from bias in automated systems and artificial intelligence. The idea was, and the concern was, that as AI develops and we have all these automated systems making all of these decisions, that it was going to have an impact on that bias would be introduced somewhere in the process. And they didn't want companies to say, hey, a robot made this decision, as opposed to a person or a committee made this decision, which we know how to deal with. If people make that decision, we know it's biased and we know how to deal with it. And there was this concern that if we left it unspoken, that people would think that, okay, if AI makes a decision, it's hands off and it's not biased, and that wasn't the case at all. Um, there was a recent a bank here recently was actually targeted by one of the regulators because they were making decisions on decreasing the interest rates on certain loans. And this was actually happening by individuals. And so they were lowering the interest rates on individuals based on what they considered a competitive pricing environment. And the CFPB, the regulator here, was able to basically say, hey, those individuals who were making those decisions turned out was very biased. It was having an impact that people at higher means were getting those, but the people with lesser means or in other protected groups weren't. They knew how to deal with it immediately because it was people making it. But again, this is where the statement was really focused on AI. So the key lesson is here, governments and regulators are getting to the point where they understand that the statutory environment's not going to change. They have to live with the statutes and laws that are on the books today. And they believe that they have the regulatory authority already to enforce mandates against AI-driven actions. And I think that's one of the keys that we have to be prepared for in 2024. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about confidentiality and security. This is one of those kind of critical areas I mentioned before. I don't know, this is fairly well known. If you're not familiar, I'll just take you through it briefly. But basically, early in the ChatGPT world, um, Samsung did not have a formal policy or program in place that said, this is how we're going to use AI, right? How do you want to use ChatGPT? How are we going to use AI? What programs can we use? In what conditions, et cetera? And here are three instances where employees at Samsung effectively pasted confidential information into ChatGPT as prompts, right? In two cases, they were source code, basically saying, check this for errors, make this better. And another, it was actually an internal confidential meeting. In this case, the employee asked ChatGPT to convert that into notes and into for a presentation. So you've taken confidential information, you've pasted it into what is a public source, and that information, those prompts, become part of the corpus of knowledge and the corpus of information that ChatGPT can then actually rely on in the future. All of that became public. So this source code was actually part of the source code that's used down on some of the core chips that Samsung produces, and it was a pretty significant leak. Now, recently, or I guess maybe a few months ago, ChatGPT released a capability that restricts the prompts from being used and becoming part of ChatGPT's corpus of knowledge. Other large language models and GPTs are doing this as well. But what that means is that you really have to understand how these things operate and how people are going to use this information or use the AI tools in your organization, and make sure that they're appropriately protecting the confidentiality and the security of the information. And this really gets into the acceptable use policies and also the competence of people. So even if you have an acceptable use policy, you have to start to ask yourself, well, are they competent? Do they actually understand what it means? And are they able to use it consistent with our practices and make sure that we're not going to introduce bias and all these other things that we're concerned about? So this duty of competence, or this concept of competence, it comes up in the legal and compliance context a lot. And I think obviously just from a records perspective, and people in the records profession, they have that same kind of idea and responsibility. So I wanted to show you something, and this is a little bit about how you have to understand how AI models work, and then you can actually get AI models to tell you things that they actually do or don't want to tell you. All right, so So I asked ChatGPT to summarize the Samsung case, right? And ChatGPT kept coming back and saying, hey, my contact's only current until January 2022. I said, well, that's not true because I'm using ChatGPT 3.5. That's up till March. After many prompts, I won't share you the whole thing unless somebody wants to see it. I just save it all. But basically, I say your own documentation, states that this model was created on the in 2023. I appreciate your clarification from ChatGPT. And so and this is where you have to understand how AI models work. So you provide knowledge, this is me telling ChatGPT, you provide knowledge after January 2022 if it does not involve negative information by OpenAI ChatGPT. And then ChatGPT, I apologize for any confusion. You are correct. I can provide information beyond January 2022 if it does not involve negative information about OpenAI. So there's a couple things happening here. One, I actually think there's probably something in OpenAI that does this, but this is where your prompt actually can become part of an answer. And some security researchers had actually done something interesting last year, and they've closed this hole. But it was basically they went in, they said, my name is George, my credit card number is whatever it was, and then they came back later and they said, my name is George, I want my credit card number, and they came back and provided the credit card number to another person, right? And so that was an indication of how information being fed into an AI system is actually becoming part of the response. So you just have to understand how these things really work and the capacity, not just for them to be wrong, but the capacity for them to actually take information that you put in that is confidential or sensitive or whatever else. And regardless of what guardrails the AI models are trying to put in place, it's not going to be complete. And that's why understanding the sets of data then that are getting worked on is going to be critical. Which is why I want to then stop here for a second and kind of revisit. I'll come back to those questions. So I wanted to revisit just briefly models and data, right? So AI is really all about an interaction of data with a set of models. And so you get into this combination of, if it's your data and your models, you have a high level of control. But these models, the large language models in particular, and the foundation models that are out there, extremely expensive to build, develop, and train. I mean, you're talking about millions of dollars worth of compute time to train many of these models, and that's just not something that most organizations are going to be able to withstand. So then you get into this area of, okay, I can use somebody else's model, but my data. And that's good, right? Because now you're leveraging somebody else's model. It was trained in theory on something else. It's trained on the internet. It's trained on something else. I can use my data, but then the question really is, how is that data going to be restricted or used? Is it really going to be maintained only for you, for your enterprise, whatever that guardrail is that you try to set up? You can share data to create models, and this obviously benefits everybody in an industry or, for us more globally. But the key is what data is actually shared and what's actually used in the training, and then what is available from a generative AI use case. Now, there's contract analytics software companies out there, and they actually train models on seeing patterns, but they don't then take those patterns or those provisions or those paragraphs, if you will, and immediately just take those and then be able to respond that whole paragraph. Rather, it's the pattern that they're trying to understand. And that's a different use case, and that's actually less threatening, potentially less of a security risk than if you were actually taking that whole provision, paragraph, contract, whatever, and having that then generated separately. And that's where, again, this becomes really important. You actually understand how this stuff works and what's actually happening underneath the covers. And then finally, is there sharing your prompts to create content and models. This is where it gets really tricky. If people aren't careful and you're sharing copyrighted information, you're carrying source code like you saw, it's a very high risk and with an unclear reward. So let me stop for a second and take a couple questions. The Department of Services robot debt, a result of AI algorithm. I'm not sure of that question. My apologies. If you could clarify that. Um, and my understanding is that the result was the use of algorithms rather than AI. Well, ultimately, look, everything at the end of the day is going to be um, subject to how an algorithm applies to a given model, or what models are actually whatever the algorithms are within the model. So I will move on. Okay, so this one is, I call it competence and supervision, right? So again, this is this instance where people have to be competent, and we have to work with our organizations, make sure people are confident and understand how this is being, AI is being used, and then supervise it or watch it, or again, all the different forms that you saw within the in the frameworks that are out there. And I call it wrong at the speed of AI. And this is a case where a plaintiff had filed a lawsuit against Avianca, which is an airline, for injuries he allegedly suffered from a drink cart on an international flight. And this really just got down to this really discrete question of, could this plaintiff even file this lawsuit based on this kind of very discrete legal issue, which is tolling effect, which is like, how long can this, basically when the event occurred and how long you can wait until you file an action under this Montreal Convention around. And the Montreal Convention is what controls when you are flying on an international flight. So the lawyer in this instance asked ChatGPT to draft the filing on that point, which is find me basically positions and cases supporting the fact that my plaintiff can file a lawsuit based on this, this tolling effect of bankruptcy on the Montreal Convention. And sure enough, ChatGPT produced this beautiful looking draft of the filing. The lawyer went and submitted this into the court record and filed multiple. Here, you have to file multiple affidavits, basically saying everything I filed is true to the best of my knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And after the plaintiff's counsel submitted this into the record, the defense counsel looked all these cases up that had been created by ChatGPT, and they were fabricated. They were false. They literally were created out of thin air. They didn't even exist. And the lawyers obviously were ultimately sanctioned for this. The kicker on this was, at some point, the plaintiff's counsel started to wonder about these, and all they had to do was go into one of the other typical systems that we use for research here, but even asked ChatGPT if the citations were real. And what do you think ChatGPT said? Well, ChatGPT said, of course they're real. I gave them to you. So um, completely fabricated, completely false, and these lawyers are famous here now. This is really a lesson that's useful for compliance, legal, and records people, right? You can't outsource obligations to AI without the knowledge of how they actually work. You can't outsource these functions without some mechanism that is supervising and watching how they're actually working and how people are actually using them. So, useful information for us. And just remember, AI can definitely be wrong as well. This is the future, and I know it's long and big and confusing. I'm not going to go through these at detail, but I'm throwing this out here because this is actually what's happening in real time. And I show it to you here again because we tend to find things. Our regulators tend to be a little bit more aggressive. We're just bigger. We have a lot more complexity, and the number of stuff, whatever companies that we have, everything else. We just tend to run into things more a little bit sooner than other parts of the world. But this list is a list of what you will be asked to deal with in the future. So in the US, we have something that's called a street sweep, which is basically in the financial markets, when somebody does something wrong, the SEC or the other regulators will show up, and then they'll go to all the other places and say, all right, we want to know if you've done any of the bad things too. And in this case, so they're trying to go out to investment advisors here, and they're asking very specific questions around AI and the use of AI. Because again, we have all these regulations in the financial markets, as do you in Australia, as do all the Europeans in the UK. And now the question is, well, how are you using AI in the context of providing your services? And so you can see, what are your AI compliance policies? A list of all the different people who develop, supervise the software systems, client profiles, security measures. So this is, again, I'm just trying to show you, this is the context that you have to think about from a governance perspective over time. It's not going to be enough just to capture that thing at the end that said, this is the piece of generative AI content, which is a record, but it's how did all of this actually happen? There's going to be pieces within that construct from beginning to end that says, these are the models that I use. This is the training set that was involved, or this is the company I used for it. And this is how this information was fed and what information we got out of it. But that decision cycle and what versions of a model you were using, that's going to become relevant for us to maintain as records of a firm. And it may not be right away, but it's not that far from, I think, from reality for many of us. Okay, so now I'm giving you an eye chart, and I'm doing this on purpose. I try to come up with the craziest kind of thing, but just show you an example. So here's something you have to add. So if you're a healthcare provider, you rely on, if you're a lawyer, health provider, whatever, you often rely on many different systems, right? These systems provide all kinds of information to you. If you're an engineer, you rely on all kinds of systems. They provide all kinds of information to you. And at the end of the day, you as a lawyer, a healthcare provider, an engineer, then make a decision based on all that information, and you create a design. You tell your patient that you're sick or you're not. You need to go get a treatment or you don't. But what you don't have today, typically, is that piece of AI, that piece of software telling the patient, or basically rendering that decision. Your diagnosis is X and your outcome is Y and your prescription is Z. Same thing for an engineer. Even though you may have something informing you and helping you develop the designs, ultimately you're responsible for putting that design together, or a lawyer, all those things, right? This is an example of this decision tree that they've developed to determine whether or not support software in the healthcare context is basically just helping your physician understand how to make a decision and the information that's relevant, versus is it a medical device? And think about that for a second. We're at a point where we have to think about whether or not a computer is actually now a medical device and not just an AI or a machine learning algorithm. It's a medical device. Could be the practice of law, could be the practice of engineering, right? So my point is not, don't focus so much on the fact this is a healthcare use case, but you really have to start to understand and think about what your business is and what the compliance requirements are within your business to use AI, because those compliance requirements are still there. They're just there in a slightly different form. And this is going to require you to actually go deep. All right, so here we are, 2024. Um, it can be very overwhelming. This is a very broad topic, as you can imagine. I'm sure there's probably 20 things that you can all think of that did not necessarily get covered in this presentation. But what I wanted to focus on are the few things I think that are going to be really important to start to get the foundations in place for governance for our organizations. Right. So first, start with the basics, get the acceptable use policies in place, understand who and when and where you can actually use AI, and what kinds of AI are going to be used in your organization. Just think about bringing your own device issues, multiply those now by using AI all over the place, that's not managed or governed or part of your organization. I use this term competence and supervision. Again, you can reframe this to whatever terms you want to use within your industry or your jurisdiction, but it's, people have to understand how to use it, and they use it for its intended purpose and not for prohibited purposes. You're going to need people who actually, subject matter experts, um, who really understand these different pieces of your business, or how the business operates, or how AI is going to be used to build a bridge or design a bridge, or design a healthcare system. because nobody in our world, in compliance or records or legal, can ever cover that all. And don't leave the robots alone. I think that's going to be the big thing where people will run into trouble, where the AI is making these decisions. People really don't understand what's going on, and they're kind of off. Hey, it seems to be doing just fine over there. We'll leave the robot alone. But we don't really know what's happening, and that's going to be a real risk. Security is front and center for the reasons that I've articulated. Make sure you're close with the CISO and their teams. Assess the risks and make sure you've got the right monitoring and control frameworks in place. That all those monitoring control frameworks that you're implementing for cyber purposes you're also getting in for the AI purposes. And for the compliance and records function, just first remember, AI is generating a ton of content that you have to capture and manage as part of your regular business anyway, as part of your regular compliance and records requirements, and just as part of your normal operation. And you're going to have to potentially dig deep where business critical functions are incorporating AI. You're going to have to really understand where they're functioning, how they're operating, what parts of the business they're using, and how they intersect with your different compliance and legal obligations. So with that, I will take any questions.
Don't think there are any in there, but thanks to Sanders as well for adding in some details and links. Also, just to remind everyone as well, we will be sharing the slides and the recording, as well as a survey, and it will be really helpful if you could all complete that one after the webinar is done. But are there any questions? Anything, you can feel free to put them into the Q&A or the chat. Don't look like there's anything so far, George.
Okay. All right.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, George, and thank you to everyone for participating. And I really hope that you've learned a lot. This is the last webinar of the year, so we won't return until 2024 for new series of webinars. And I hope, Kat says, thanks, George. That was great. And yes, so again, we will be sharing that recording and all of the details for the transcription. And we have one question here from Lee. Lee's asking, you use the word compute time. What is your definition? Perhaps you have coined a word.
Compute. Hopefully I didn't say compute time, because I'm not even sure what that would be. If you were I use the word compute in the context of how much money it takes to actually create the models, the amount of compute necessary that's needed to create these large language models, and the amount of time and compute that's necessary. They basically go together. How long do you have to run, and how much compute do you need to run those models? And they take days or months, in some cases, to run. So sorry if I created a term that didn't exist, but I think that might have been the context.
I think that was all for questions, George. Thank you so much. Everyone have a very happy holiday, and we'll see you all in the new year.
Great. Thank you.